Well, hey, welcome to this next installment of the Foundation series from Christ Community Church. This week we look at the Davidic covenant, the covenant that God made with David. Now, through this series, we are looking at the Bible, trying to understand how it's structured and how it leads us to Jesus. And the key to understanding the structure of the Bible is understanding the covenants, the agreements that God has made with humanity throughout the ages. So we have looked at the Adamic covenant at the beginning in the Garden of Eden, and the Noahic covenant, and the Abrahamic covenant, and the Mosaic covenant last time, and now we are to the Davidic covenant. So before we jump into the terms of the covenant and the covenant that God actually makes with David, we have to go back and see where we've been on the lead up to King David. Now, you've probably heard of King David. He's well known even outside of Christianity and Judaism. King David comes along. He's the second king of Israel. So last time we talked about the Mosaic covenant, when God made a covenant with Moses, as God used Moses to lead the children of Israel, his people, out of slavery in Egypt and into the land he had promised to their forefather Abraham. And he sets up Israel as a nation state now. It's in the Exodus, that leaving of Egypt and coming into the promised land, that the children of Abraham, the Israelite people, become a nation. And for a while, they're ruled over by these people called judges. God gives the nation judges to rule over them and to reign over them. But over time, the people of Israel start looking out at the rest of the world, and they see that the other nations of the world have kings. They have a central authority figure who rules and reigns and who has final say in everything and who leads the nation. And the Israelite people become a little jealous. And they begin to call out to God, God, would you give us a king? Would you give us a king? Would you give us a king? And God responds to the people and says, you don't want a king. God says, a king is going to conscript your children into armies, and a king is going to have absolute authority and absolute power, and you don't want that. You want me to be your king. And finally, the prophet Samuel, one who speaks to God and who speaks to the people of the nation, Samuel comes to God and says, God, they still want a king. And God says, Samuel, don't be downhearted. It's not you they have rejected, it's me. I should be their king, but I'm going to give them what they want, and they're not going to like it. And the king is going to lead them into all kinds of terrible places. But God acquiesces and gives in to the people and gives them a king. And the first man that God calls as king of Israel is a guy named Saul. And Saul looks good at the start. He's tall, he's strong, he's proud, and he looks like he's going to lead the nation well. And then Saul becomes power hungry. And Saul begins to lead poorly. And so God says, no, I'm going to have to replace him. And he sends Samuel out to this guy named Jesse. And Jesse has a bunch of sons. And God tells Samuel, hey, you'll know the guy. You'll know the son of Jesse who I'm calling to be king of Israel when you see him. And so Jesse parades his sons in front of Samuel, and Samuel looks at all of them, and it's clear none of them are the guys. And these are strong, strapping young men. And so Samuel goes to Jesse and says, Jesse, do you have any more sons? And Jesse says, well, there's David. He's kind of the runt of the litter. He's the small guy. He's out. He's the shepherd. And so he's out with the flocks right now. But he's the little guy. He's not king material. And nevertheless, Jesse brings David before Samuel. And Samuel looks at David and God says, that's him. That's the guy. Anoint him as the next king. And so Samuel anoints David as king. Now, the way that David actually becomes king of Israel is just this crazy, long, wild story with all kinds of drama and violence, and it's really harrowing. But finally, David becomes the king of Israel. And when David, in the process of becoming king, has finally brought the nation to a place of peace, when war has finally ended and hostilities have finally ended and he's established the capital in Jerusalem, David is finally ready to build a temple to God. This is David's driving motivation in life. He wants to be the king to build a temple for God, because up until this point, God has been living in a tent. God's presence has been carried around in the Ark of the Covenant inside of a tent that has gone with the people from place to place. But now that David has established a single capital for the nation of Israel, now that he's established a home for the people, he wants to build a great temple to God. This is what people do. But God comes to David and says, David, you're not going to be the one to build my temple. Enjoy your life. Enjoy the blessings that I have given you. Enjoy the house of cedar that you live in, but you're not going to build my temple. It'll be your son who builds my temple. And that's part of this covenant that God makes with David that we read about here in 2 Samuel chapter 7. And so that's where we're going to turn to read about the Davidic covenants. So now let's take a look here at what God says to David in 2 Samuel chapter 7. This is God speaking to the prophet Nathan, telling Nathan what to tell David. In the Old Testament, the prophets are the ones who speak to God and through whom God speaks to the kings and to the nations. And so here, God is speaking to Nathan, telling Nathan what to tell David about the agreement God is going to make. This is in verses 8 to 16 of 2 Samuel chapter 7. So now this is what you are to say to my servant David. This is what the Lord of armies says. I took you from the pasture, from tending the flock, to be ruler over my people Israel. I have been with you wherever you have gone, and I have destroyed all your enemies before you. I will make a great name for you, like that of the greatest on the earth. I will designate a place for my people Israel and plant them, so that they may live there and not be disturbed again. Evildoers will not continue to oppress them as they have done, ever since the day I ordered judges to be over my people Israel. I will give you rest from all your enemies. The Lord declares to you, the Lord himself will make a house for you. When your time comes and you rest with your fathers, I will raise up after you your descendant, who will come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son. When he does wrong, I will discipline him with a rod of men and blows from mortals. But my faithful love will never leave him, as it did when I removed it from Saul, whom I removed from before you. Your house and kingdom will endure before me forever, and your throne will be established forever. That is the covenant that God makes with David. And like the covenant God made with Abraham, it's unconditional. Right? There's no sense here in which God will remove this covenant if David doesn't live up to the standard somehow, or he doesn't live up to his end. God is saying, I'm going to establish your kingdom forever. The line of kings will always come through you, David. And so this covenant has two parts. One is a near fulfillment, something that will happen soon to the life of David, and something that's going to happen later, or something down the road. The near part here is that God is saying, I'm going to use your son to build my temple. Your descendant, one of your children, will be king after you, and he will build the temple for me. I'm going to establish your house, God says, and then your son is going to establish my house here in Jerusalem. And then the second part of that is that David would have a child who would reign over Israel forever. There would never cease to be a son of David who would reign on the throne of Israel. And so this is the two parts of this covenant. Now, David's son Solomon comes after him, and God allows Solomon to build the temple of Yahweh, the temple of God. And this temple would stand until 586 BC when it was destroyed. And then it would be rebuilt again 2 times until finally being destroyed in 70 AD. And so God allows Solomon to build the temple that his father David wanted so desperately to build but was never able to. The second part of this is that God would establish David's throne, and a son of David would always rule over Israel. And this was true. As long as the nation of Israel and the nation of Judah existed, there was a son of David on the throne. The problem was that those nations didn't exist forever. There would come times in their history when the nation would be carted away, would be taken off, overtaken by another empire, and it would no longer have a king in place. By the time we get to the life of Jesus, at the end of the BC era and kind of the beginning of the next era of history. By the time we get to the time of Jesus, Israel, Judah, this area that God had given his children to settle, was ruled over by the Roman Empire. And Israel didn't really have a king. Judea had a governor, a Roman governor who was put in place. There was a guy they called king, King Herod, who ruled over Judea at the time of Jesus. But he wasn't the Davidic king. He wasn't the king that God had intended for the people to have. And so this covenant with David is the root of the idea of Messiah, of Christ, of the king deliverer, the one who would come to God's people and deliver them from the hands of oppressive empires and oppressive rulers. This covenant that God makes with David is the heart of the idea of Messiah, the delivering king who would come. Because God's people recognized that under the rules and reigns of these empires who had come in and taken over the land, they didn't really have a king in the way that God intended them to have a king. They didn't really have a king in the way that God had promised to David, but that one day God would send the ruler in the line of David to finally rule over his children forever. And that's what brings us, of course, to Jesus Christ. Matthew, at the beginning of his gospel, takes pains to establish that Jesus is the descendant of David. Luke does the same thing, where at the beginning they want you to be sure that this guy they're talking about, this Jesus they're talking about, is a descendant of King David, that he is the rightful heir to the throne of Israel and of Judah, and that Jesus is the king who will reign over God's people. This is the first point in establishing that Jesus is the long-awaited Messiah, the deliverer king who is coming to God's people. And Jesus, of course, lived, and he never ascended to a throne. He never took a throne. In fact, in mockery at Jesus' execution, they put a crown of thorns on his head to say, "What kind of king are you to be crucified?" But then, on the third day after he was crucified, Jesus rose. And in his resurrection, and then as he ascended to the Father 40 days later, Jesus ascended to the right hand of God, to the throne of the nation, and took his rightful place. The Apostle Peter in Acts chapter 2 says that God took this Jesus whom had been crucified and made him Lord and Messiah. That is, Jesus is the deliverer king. And because he has risen again, never to die again, Jesus is the fulfillment of that covenant with David. Jesus is the son of David who will reign forever on his throne over God's people. And Jesus is the deliverer king, the Messiah who has come to rule not only over the nation of Israel, not only over the chosen people of God in some geopolitical sense, but to reign and rule over the kingdom of God that includes everybody who would swear their allegiance to him as king. Jesus is the fulfillment of the Davidic covenant. And as we move into the next session of our foundation series, we're going to be looking at that new covenant that Jesus makes, the new covenant in Christ that includes all people from every background and from every walk of life who would bow their knee to King Jesus. And so I hope you'll join me next time for our next session in this foundation series. Until then, you can still send in your questions. I would love to have a conversation with you about this as we continue to walk through the covenants and understand just how God has spoken to us and how God interacts with his people.